She woke in the middle of the night. The wall near the door was no longer solid. Something gray and shifting slipped through it, crawling low across the room. It hovered above her bed, staring. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. Then it came closer. Close enough for her to see its eyes, completely black, perfectly still. With each return, its shape sharpened. First a figure, then a face, then a voice, speaking in fast, coded bursts. And one night, the signification of his presence dawned on her. He was not alone, and the manipulations were part of something larger. This episode begins with a man who stood at odds with the conventional. Karel Rašín, born in 1956, is an independent journalist, translator, and author who has spent decades investigating claims that many would prefer to ignore. In 2009, he founded Exopolitika Česká republika and continues to lead Project Alpha, one of the few Czech initiatives focused on direct witness testimony and UFO abduction research. In a country where such topics have long been marginalized or openly mocked, Rašín chose another path. He was not content to dismiss the strange, the unexplained, or the uncomfortable. Let's rewind a bit. In the late 1990s, public interest in extraterrestrial presence and its political implications was virtually non-existent in the Czech Republic. The same was true for ufology more broadly. Awareness of UFO-related issues was minimal, if not entirely absent. Officially, only 2 organized groups were active in the country. The better known was Project GLOW, based in Prague. The other was KPUFO, the Club of Psychotronic and UFO Studies based in Plzeň. A few smaller regional groups existed, but remained almost completely out of public view. Rašín, living in Prague, had been interested in the UFO phenomenon since youth. Early on, he developed a strong sense that mainstream scientific accounts of human origins and history were incomplete. That conviction deepened during his teenage years, especially after reading Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. He rejected the standard evolutionary explanation of human ancestry and believed that parts of our past had been deliberately obscured. His views, often regarded as eccentric, set him apart, and ultimately led him to reject formal academic paths. Instead, he became a freelance journalist, determined to pursue his own lines of inquiry. In 1998, Karel joined Project GLOW, at the time the only group in Prague seriously involved in UFO research. He quickly began to receive letters from individuals who claimed to have experienced abductions. The volume and consistency of these accounts prompted him to form a small team of investigators. Together, they conducted detailed interviews, field visits, and long-term case follow-ups. The result was Close Encounter of the Fourth Kind, Reality of UFO Abductions in the Czech Republic, published by Votobia in 2002. It remains the only Czech book to examine the abduction phenomenon in such depth. The work is based on 10 selected cases, but his database has since expanded to include more than 130 documented reports from across the country. In this episode, we will sketch the outlines of 2 cases investigated and documented by Karel. The first incident took place in 1991, not long after Karel himself, together with his family, had moved into a new apartment. There was still work to be done, such as repairs, organizing, and things left unfinished after the move. The departure of the children for camp gave Karel a rare window of quiet to work through what was left to do. Among them was Petra, the daughter, who was around 9 or 10 years old at the time. She was getting ready for her usual camp stay, something she looked forward to every summer. Like most children her age, she greeted the start of the holidays with excitement. The summer camp took place not far from Prague, near the town of Pelhřimov, roughly 120 kilometers to the southeast. Once the camp ended, the children returned home as usual. A few days later, during a casual conversation, Petra brought up something unexpected. She turned to her parents and asked quite directly what they thought about flying saucers. The question came as a surprise. UFOs had never been a topic in the household. It simply wasn't something the family talked about or showed any open interest in. The parents were caught off guard and unsure how to respond. Petra seemed to notice the hesitation. Without waiting for an answer, she took it upon herself to clear things up. She called over her friend, who happened to be visiting that day, and who had also attended the camp. The two girls then began to describe what they had experienced just days earlier, while still at the campsite. It was the last evening of the camp. The children had gathered around a large fire. They sang songs, passed around a guitar, and took in the final hours before returning home the next day. The mood was relaxed, the kind that settles in when something is coming to an end. Later that night, sometime around 10 or 11 p.m., something unusual happened. The darkness that had surrounded the campsite began to shift, and without warning, the area lit up. People began to look around, trying to understand what had changed. The children looked up. So did the camp leaders. Above them, a large object was silently crossing the night sky. It was clearly visible, a flying saucer drifting overhead in complete silence. From beneath the craft, 3 beams of light shone down, sweeping across the entire camp like giant spotlights. According to witnesses, the saucer was surrounded by a strong glow. The light made it appear blue, like the sky on a clear day. It hovered without movement above the campsite, and the beams from underneath moved slowly across the ground, lighting up everything they touched. Before long, confusion spread. Children began to shout and scramble. Adults tried to make sense of what was happening. The camp leaders quickly stepped in, guiding the children back to their tents. A curfew was put in place. No one was allowed outside. They were told not to look out, not to leave, not to ask questions. Even so, some of the more curious children peeked through the tent flaps, eyes fixed on the sky. By then, the saucer had shifted position. It moved slowly toward the edge of the forest nearby. Then it stopped again, still and silent, just above the tops of the spruces. Moments later, something detached from the underside of the craft. A large glowing sphere began to descend, drifting down behind the trees. Not long after, a loud sound was heard. A deep roar echoed across the area. Then, after a pause, the saucer rose again, lifting above the forest with the same quiet presence as before. Although the curfew remained in effect, it was followed mainly by the adults. Some of the children continued to peek out, whisper, and even slip quietly between the tents. A small group of girls, including Petra, came up with a plan. They told the adults they needed to go to the restroom, which gave them a reason to leave the tent. In reality, they wanted to slip away and explore. Curiosity had gotten the better of them, and the restroom was located right at the edge of the forest. On their way back from this short expedition, something made 2 of the girls stop in their tracks. Just ahead, on the path that led from the forest back toward the camp, 3 tall white figures were standing. The figures were around 2 meters high. To the girls, they looked like people dressed in full-body suits, similar to the appearance of astronauts. Their faces were hidden behind rounded helmets, making it impossible to see any features. For a moment, both the girls and the figures simply stared at one another. No one moved. No one spoke. The forest was quiet. What happened next seemed to be a kind of silent exchange. For a brief moment, the girls and the figures simply stood there, watching each other. Then the figures began to retreat. Their movements were slow and deliberate. Without a sound, they turned and made their way back into the forest. The girls didn't wait. They ran straight to their tents and told the camp leaders what they had seen. As it turned out, they were not the only ones. Other children had also spotted the white figures among the trees. Some of the children had seen a glowing sphere rise slowly above the treetops, hover for a moment, then drift back toward the saucer and disappear into its underside. Eventually, the flying object began to move. It drifted away in complete silence. The sky returned to darkness. Slowly, the camp settled down again. One by one, the tents fell quiet. In the morning, as the camp slowly came back to life, a few of the adults made their way over to the fire pit to see how things looked. They expected to find the usual remains, some scattered ash, blackened logs, maybe a few half-burnt sticks. But what they found was something else entirely. The fire itself was cold, but the scene around it looked as a disaster had struck. Everything made of wood had been reduced to splinters. The benches where the children had sat were broken apart. The logs used for seating had been split and scattered. Even the axe that had been left lying nearby was ruined. Its handle had been snapped, and only the metal head was left intact. No tracks, no signs of any impact, no explanation. And strangely, nothing else in the camp had been touched. The tents and cabins stood exactly as they had the night before. Whatever had happened, it had come right up to the edge of where people were sleeping, and then stopped. After the usual morning routine, a group of the oldest children decided to walk to the place where the glowing sphere had appeared the night before. It was not far, only about 5 minutes from the camp. When they arrived, they found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The area looked like a landing site. In the center of the clearing was a circular pit. It measured roughly 6 meters across and about a meter deep. The edge of the pit was sharply defined, as if it had been cut with precision. The ground around it was bare. Whatever plants, moss, or leaves had been there were now gone. The forest floor had been stripped clean. The group looked around and tried to make sense of it. They noticed that some pieces of wood were missing, and they came to the conclusion that something or someone had taken them. With that, the children walked back to camp in silence. When they got back, the parents were already arriving to pick them up and bring them home. For Karel Rašín, the year 2009 became a turning point. That year, a deeply unsettling discovery led him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about Project Glow. Officially, Project Glow had been founded to collect global data on UFO sightings and to process that information through statistical analysis. But in Karel's experience, the project failed to deliver. It remained passive, disconnected from international research, and made little real progress. He found the group's evaluations superficial. Many of its members, in his view, were what he called armchair researchers, people who preferred to dismiss unusual reports by default and search for familiar explanations. The leadership, he noted, selected members who were skeptical and highly critical by design. As for the topic of exopolitics, it was not debated or discussed. It was rejected outright and treated with open ridicule. In time, the group began to actively demonize it. Then came the discovery that, in Karel's words, changed everything. He found out that the head of Project Glow was, in fact, an officer with the Office for Foreign Relations and Information, an intelligence service partly connected to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. From that moment, it became clear to him that the real function of Project Glow was to gather information from its members, sightings, testimonies, and other reports, which would then be passed on for intelligence purposes. None of this had ever been disclosed to the group. Karel and 4 of his colleagues immediately left. Together, they founded a new group, establishing Exopolitics Czech Republic. Over time, the network grew to include a larger number of active members or supporters. The summer camp case became one of the first major investigations after the formation of the Exopolitics group. What seemed at first like a contained event turned out to be far more complex. In the days that followed, several of the children began to report strange and vivid dreams. In these dreams, they found themselves aboard a spacecraft. Some described lying on examination tables, unable to move. Others recalled watching shifting images that resembled holograms, projected from unfamiliar panels or monitors. A few spoke of being shown devices they could not identify but believed were connected to propulsion or energy systems. What struck Karel most was the consistency of the details. These were independent accounts, but they followed the same structure and tone. All of the children described the beings as very tall and human-like in appearance. The presence of these entities was not comforting, but it was not aggressive either. The children said they felt watched, not threatened. The beings remained silent, detached. For Karel, these accounts pointed to something that could not be dismissed as suggestion or imagination. And what unsettled him even more was that, in the years that followed, he would encounter other cases with strikingly similar details. We now turn to another case submitted by Karel Rašín and included in his published work. It involves a series of strange and unsettling events. Please be advised that the following account contains references to sexual harassment. Out of respect for the principal witness, some details of the second incident have been intentionally softened. The case centers on Petra, a 29-year-old woman living in Prague with her husband and 5-year-old daughter. In 2010, Petra was living in an apartment in Prague when something strange began to happen. One night, she woke to see a gray, cloud-like shape emerging from the wall near the door. It moved slowly across the bedroom, crawling toward her bed. Then it hovered above her, still making the same crawling motions. The experience did not end there. Similar encounters followed throughout the year. Each time, the form appeared clearer, gradually taking on the outline of a figure, less a cloud, more a presence. With each visit, it became more defined, more like a being. In all of this, there was a detail Petra couldn't explain. From her position in bed, the door should have been out of view, blocked by a large piece of furniture. Yet during every encounter, she could see it clearly. Whenever the figure appeared, Petra found herself completely paralyzed. At the same time, her awareness became sharp. She entered a strange, altered state, where every sense felt amplified. The being seemed able to move her body without touching her. Wherever it looked, she followed. It turned her from side to side, onto her back, onto her stomach, only by shifting its gaze. She was powerless to resist. Often the being would simply stare into her eyes for a long time. Then it would begin to speak, but the speech was rapid, mechanical, and incomprehensible. Its mouth moved at an unnatural speed, almost as if it were made of plastic, warped by the motion. Petra could never understand the words, but the sound reminded her of encoded messages. This same sequence happened again and again. One night, Petra's daughter woke up in a state of terror and began to cry uncontrollably. She had been sleeping beside her mother, and the crying was immediate and hysterical. Petra quickly turned on the light and rushed to her side. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Through tears, the little girl replied, "Mum, there was something watching me just right by the door." "Who was watching you?" Petra asked. The girl pointed and said, "Next to the door." Something was standing there. It looked like a gray cloud or a big gray beetle. "I am scared to death." Petra brought her daughter into her arms, held her close, and stayed with her until she eventually fell back asleep. As the appearances continued, the nature of the encounters began to shift. After the usual long periods of staring, the being would sometimes come much closer, even positioning itself directly in front of her. Petra began to notice more details. He wore a strange suit that looked like fur, threaded with silver sparks. On the front were 3 large button-like objects. His face had a narrow mouth that moved rapidly when he spoke, almost like something animated. His eyes were large and completely black, like deep voids. His hair was short, his nose indistinct, and his overall shape was humanoid. He stood between 2 and 2.5 meters tall, with broad shoulders like a football defender. She never saw his feet, but one detail stood out. The shape of his hands was strange, especially the thumbs, which were long and protruding. She again found herself in an altered state of awareness. Without knowing how it had begun, she realized she was on her knees, facing the wall while kneeling on the bed. What followed was a strong physical sensation, perceived as sexual stimulation from behind. At the time, her husband was not home. When the experience ended, she quietly spoke, asking the presence to leave. It did. After that, she fell asleep. One of the final encounters took place near the end of April 2012. Petra woke in the middle of the night with a strong sense that the man from the wall had returned. The moment she saw him, her body became paralyzed, and she once again entered a strange, altered state of awareness. This time he was standing very close, almost face to face. Petra was lying in bed next to her daughter. Her husband was not home that night. According to Petra, her husband had never sensed anything unusual, even though he had been present during several of the earlier encounters. Suddenly, Petra felt that the man from the wall was on the bed and that his attention was focused on her daughter. She became very afraid and began repeating to herself that he should leave her daughter alone. She later described his face in detail and noted that his neck appeared strange, as if it had been assembled from small, connected circles. The being was kneeling on the bed. Then, without warning, a long silver object appeared in his hand, about 30 centimeters in length. It reminded her of something very specific. In her words, like a railroad dispatcher with a signal disc allowing the train to move. The object frightened her. She thought it might be a kind of scalpel. She held her daughter close and refused to let go. Then the space around her began to change. The wall behind the figure seemed to dissolve, revealing what looked like a large holographic screen. Through it, she could see into another room, and details began to emerge. The room was lit by a strange yellow-white light shining from the ceiling. It had an unnatural quality that was hard for her to describe. It was not the kind of light you switch on when entering a room. This one seemed focused, directed downward, illuminating only the space beneath it. In the middle of the room, she saw something that looked like a bed. The back wall was made of an unusual material, something like tiles. It had a bluish, glass-like surface that glowed with a cold light. Suddenly, a wave of fear came over her. She realized she had been in that room before. It was an operating theater. There was no doubt in her mind. The moment she recognized it, the vision vanished. Later, more memories of this room would surge back. She had been brought into a strange room with many beings, all identical to the man from the wall. On a table, she saw another figure that resembled them, surrounded by others. This one appeared ill, or without a soul, or perhaps somehow dried out. She saw tubes connected to both of her arms, with a black liquid being drawn from her body. She felt the being on the table was going to die, and she had no idea why she had been brought there. The others stood in silence, watching, as if waiting to see what she would do. She would later sketch this scene, but for now it remained at the edge of her awareness. When the vision of the holographic screen dissolved, she became aware that the man from the wall had returned. But this time, he was not alone. A second figure stood beside him, smaller in size but identical in appearance. Both beings remained still, staring at her in silence. She could not move. Once again, she found herself in that altered state of mind, conscious but unable to act. Without any conscious movement, she found herself lying in a posture she later described as sexually exposed. This was followed by a sensation of sexual arousal, which she associated with external physical stimulation, though no visible presence could be identified. After some time, the sensation faded, the presence withdrew, and she drifted back into sleep. What are we to make of these events? A summer camp lit up by a silent craft. A forest clearing scorched without fire. Children who never forgot what they saw. And years later, a woman haunted by visitations that changed her body, her sleep, and her sense of self. And then there is Karel Rašín. He is not a neutral observer. His life's work has been shaped by conviction, not by caution. From an early age, he rejected the official explanations of where we come from and what counts as real. He never sought validation from institutions. He walked away from them and from official UFO groups when he found them compromised. Instead, he built his own archive. He listened. He recorded. He believed. It's easy to call him eccentric. He is. But eccentricity can mean persistence outside the limits of consensus. And Rašín has persisted. For decades, he has collected testimony from people whose lives were split open by experiences they could not explain. He took their words seriously when few others would. He gave them structure, language, and sometimes a kind of dignity. His work doesn't offer easy answers. It's tangled, sometimes speculative, sometimes unsettling. But it insists on attention. Think carefully and form your own opinion. Karel Rašín's work insists that these things happened and that they matter. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Want to support what we're doing here on the channel? Like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. We'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome our new members to the channel. And of course, we also want to thank our ongoing supporters. See you next week. Until then, stay tuned and stay curious. We appreciate all of you.